The HOA built 37 luxury villas inside my family's dry lake. Then the water came home. The HOA built 37 luxury villas inside my family's dry lake because they were convinced the water was gone forever. They were wrong about the land, wrong about the records, and wrong about the one thing my father taught me never to argue with: gravity. There hasn't been a lake here in years. Rebecca Sterling said it at 6:37 on a cold Tuesday morning. Standing in the middle of Caldwell Lake like water needed her permission to exist. I was 56 years old, a water resources engineer, and I had spent most of my life around reservoirs, spillways, drainage systems, watersheds, and people who underestimated all four. I knew what abandoned ground looked like. I also knew what a lake looked like when the water had been temporarily taken away. Rebecca did not. From the ridge above the basin, I counted roofs. 1, 7, 14, 23, 37. 37 luxury villas stood inside my family's lake. Some were still skeletal frames wrapped in White House wrap. Others had cedar siding, black roofs, stone patios, and windows reflecting a pale November sky. Fresh concrete driveways curved across old drainage contours. Utility trenches cut through clay where I had caught bluegill with my father when I was 12. Nail guns cracked through the morning. A concrete mixer groaned near Villa 11. Diesel fumes mixed with wet earth and sawdust. And beside the temporary sales office, a glossy sign announced, Silver Pines Estates, Caldwell Lakefront Living. Lakefront. That word almost made me laugh. Rebecca walked toward me from a white SUV wearing a tailored navy coat and boots clean enough to prove she had not been there long. She was president of the Silver Pines Estates HOA. Marcus Dean, the project manager, followed with rolled plans under one arm. You shouldn't be inside an active construction zone, Rebecca said. I looked down at the cracked lakebed beneath my boots. Interesting choice of words. Her smile tightened. This property has been approved for development. Whose property? Silver Pines secured the necessary rights. From whom? Our attorneys handled the acquisition. That wasn't my question. Behind her, Villa 12 stood where 6 feet of water used to be. Villa 21 sat across an old inflow path. Villa 34 was almost directly in line with the western control structure. Then I saw the faded red mark. Halfway up the old concrete structure, worn by decades of weather, was a line my father had painted when I was a teenager. Normal operating elevation. Rebecca followed my eyes. What? I pointed at the villas. What finished floor elevation did you build at? They were engineered. That wasn't my question either. Marcus shifted the plans under his arm. What elevation? I asked again. He glanced toward the red line and did not answer. A nail gun popped 3 times behind us. Pop, pop, pop. Rebecca folded her arms. You can't keep calling empty ground a lake. I walked far enough to line up the red mark with the lowest row of villas. Several foundations sat visibly beneath it. My stomach tightened. Not because I wanted water there tomorrow. I didn't. Not with workers, equipment, buyers, utilities, and unfinished structures in the basin. It tightened because somebody had poured millions of dollars into concrete without understanding where the water belonged. I took out my phone and photographed the red line, the foundations, the access road, the utility trenches, and the sales sign. Rebecca stepped closer. If you intend to interfere with this project, speak to our attorney. I will. You don't have authority over this development. I looked at the red line one more time. No, I said. But gravity does. She stared at me like I had threatened her. I hadn't. I was remembering my father. He first told me, water can leave without giving up its address. When I was 11 years old, barefoot on the western spillway with a fishing pole in one hand and a peanut butter sandwich in the other. Caldwell Lake was full then. 80 acres of morning light, base beneath the dock, cottonwoods along the northern creek, small waves slapping dark concrete below our feet. Dad pointed at the red line he had painted on the control structure. Remember that, Mark. Why? Because someday the water won't be there. I thought he meant drought. He shook his head. Water moves. Shorelines move. But elevations, drainage, storage, and boundaries don't stop maturing just because the water leaves for a while. Never confuse where the water is today with where it belongs. 35 years later, I could still hear his voice. The Caldwell family had owned the lakebed and surrounding property for generations. My grandfather rebuilt the western control structure in the 1960s. Dad maintained the shoreline, inflow channel, spillway, and drainage system until his knees gave out. I became a water resources engineer because I grew up fascinated by the invisible rules underneath everything he showed me. 7 years before Silver Pines started building, Caldwell Lake entered a controlled drawdown and rehabilitation program. We lowered it gradually for shoreline stabilization, sediment work, drainage repair, and inspection of the control structure. Fish were relocated where necessary. Every major change was documented. The system was inspected. The lake was dry because work required it to be dry. It had never been abandoned. That distinction was about to become extremely expensive. That afternoon, I drove to the old maintenance barn with my son Luke. He was 29 and had inherited my father's impatience with people who ignored fences, deeds, or common sense. 37 houses? He asked. Villas. That makes it better. Apparently, it makes them cost more. Inside the barn, I opened a steel cabinet that had not been cleaned since Clinton was president. Dust floated through Luke's flashlight beam. We pulled out deeds, survey maps, maintenance logs, inspection records, and historical engineering drawings. At the bottom was Dad's blue waterproof field notebook. The cover was scratched and stained with old mud. His blocky handwriting filled the pages: elevations, dates, measurements, repairs, notes about the northern inflow. Then I found the western structure sketch. A red pencil line crossed the drawing. Normal operating elevation. Luke leaned over my shoulder. That's the mark you saw? Exactly. He looked through the barn door toward the distant roofs. How far below it are they? Don't guess. I handed him the drawing. We measure. Before leaving, Luke stopped beside an old aluminum fishing boat stored upside down against the wall. It had belonged to Dad. There was still a dent near the bow from the summer I backed his truck into it at 16. Luke wiped dust from the hull. You think this thing will ever float out there again? I looked across the dry basin. That's what the system was built for. The next morning, Luke found a Silver Pines brochure clipped to the temporary sales office fence. 37 luxury villas. Private streets. Stone patios. Panoramic views. Across the cover were 4 polished words. Caldwell Lakefront Living. Luke stared at it. They sold lakefront homes inside the lake. They want the lake when they're selling houses, I said. And when they're building them? Then apparently it's just dirt. That contradiction bothered me more than Rebecca's attitude. Before we left the basin that afternoon, a black crossover pulled into the gravel lot beside the sales office. A couple climbed out carrying a folder stamped Silver Pines closing documents. They were both in their 40s. The man introduced himself as Aaron Mills. His wife, Dana, kept looking past us toward Villa 18. That one is ours, she said. Not ours legally, I thought. Not yet, but I understood what she meant. They had put down a substantial deposit 3 months earlier. Their youngest daughter was supposed to start school nearby the following fall. Dana had already chosen furniture for the upstairs room that faced what the brochure called the restored Caldwell Lake view. Aaron looked from the brochure in his hand to the cracked clay beneath his shoes. Is the lake actually coming back? Rebecca answered before I could. The community water feature is part of a future beautification plan. There is no active lake here now. Future water feature. That was new. I looked at the brochure Aaron was holding. The rendering showed blue water stretching behind the villas, a canoe near a dock, and sunset reflected across a surface that the county application had described as permanently dewatered. Dana noticed me reading it. Mr. Caldwell, is this your lake? Rebecca stepped between us slightly. This is a complicated property dispute that is being handled by counsel. Dana's eyes narrowed. That wasn't what I asked. For the second time in 2 days, somebody had borrowed my line. I kept my answer careful. My family has recorded ownership claims and water management records that Silver Pines has been asked to verify against its own documents. That process needs to finish before anyone should tell you more than the records support. Aaron looked at Rebecca. Were we told about a property dispute before we signed? There was no active dispute when you signed. Was there an ownership question? Rebecca's face changed by half a degree. Nothing material had been identified. Helen, standing several feet away, wrote that sentence down. I noticed. Rebecca noticed me noticing. The couple left without touring Villa 18. It made me even more certain about one thing. I was not going to touch the gate. I was not going to block equipment. I was not going to give Rebecca a single photograph that could turn this into a story about an angry landowner destroying somebody else's dream. If Silver Pines had built its project on a bad assumption, The assumption would have to collapse under evidence, not under my temper. By noon, I was sitting across from Helen Carter, a land use attorney who had spent 23 years watching people confuse permits with property rights. Helen did not care about dramatic stories until documents made them useful. I put Dad's notebook, our deed records, the rehabilitation file, and the Silver Pines brochure on her conference table. She read in silence. Then she opened the county planning packet. Her finger stopped halfway down one page. Interesting. What? She turned the document toward me. The environmental description identified Caldwell Lake as a permanently dewatered basin suitable for residential development. I read it twice. Then I placed the sales brochure beside it. Lakefront living. Permanently dewatered basin. Same project. Same ground. Two completely different stories depending on who was reading. Helen leaned back. We don't accuse anyone of anything yet. Agreed. We find out who supplied each statement, what title they relied on, and what water control records they reviewed. Facts first. Always. The following morning, Helen sent formal notices to Silver Pines Estates, the developer, and Marcus requesting three things immediately: proof of title to the lakebed, the operating elevation used in the site design, and the documents supporting the claim that Caldwell Lake was permanently dewatered. She also warned them that continuing construction while those issues remained unresolved could increase their exposure. Rebecca called 47 minutes later. You hired an attorney? You built 37 villas. We have permits. Then verification should be easy. This is harassment, Eli. No, it's a records request. The basin is in used acreage. According to whom? Our consultants. Which consultant verified ownership? Silence. Then she said, you had years to object. I objected when Silver Pines tried to buy part of the eastern basin 3 years ago. Another silence. That was different. Yes, I said. Back then you remembered who owned it. She hung up. That old purchase offer mattered. Silver Pines had once treated my family's ownership as real enough to negotiate over. Now that millions had been poured into construction, dry ground had somehow become theirs by assumption. The title search did more than fail to find a transfer. It uncovered a chain of documents that made Silver Pines' position harder to explain. 3 years earlier, when the HOA had approached me about buying a narrow strip along the eastern basin for a walking path and landscaping buffer, its own attorney had attached a parcel map identifying Caldwell Family Reservoir tracked along the boundary. The offer had gone nowhere, but the letter mattered now because it showed Silver Pines had once recognized the lakebed as somebody else's property. Helen put that letter beside the later Phase 2 planning exhibit. Same organization, she said. Different map. Different purpose, I said. Exactly. A few days later, Silver Pines held what it called an informational meeting for affected buyers and residents. I did not attend, but Aaron Mills did, and afterward he forwarded Helen the written summary the HOA distributed. The summary claimed 3 things. Silver Pines possessed all required development approvals. The basin had been dry for years, and an adjacent landowner had recently asserted an unexpected claim that could affect completion. Unexpected. Helen read that word twice. Then she opened the Eastern Basin purchase letter from 3 years earlier. Interesting definition of unexpected. Marcus called me that evening. His voice was lower than usual. Eli, I need to ask you something off the record. There is no off the record anymore. A pause. Fair enough. Did Silver Pines ever try to buy basin land from you before Phase 2? Yes. When? 3 years ago. Another pause. I wasn't told that. Who told you the basin was available? The site package. The planning overlay. A summary from the board side. Did you order a boundary survey before laying out the villas? We used the development survey tied to the parcel information we were given. That's not the same answer. I know. For the first time, Marcus sounded less like a project manager defending a schedule and more like an engineer realizing somebody had handed him a loaded assumption. I signed off on construction sequencing based on that package, he said. I'm not asking you to take my side. I'm not. I'm trying to figure out what side the documents are on. That's the only side worth worrying about. 2 days later, Marcus began preserving his own project emails and forwarding relevant records through counsel. He did not become my ally. That would have been too simple. He became something more useful, a professional who understood that if the project was wrong, pretending harder would not make it right. That afternoon, Marcus came alone. No Rebecca. No attorneys. Just plans and work boots covered in actual mud. Rebecca says you're claiming we built inside an active lake. I'm saying your project needs better questions. He looked around the basin. Show me the lake. I looked down. A pale freshwater shell lay beside his boot. I pointed at it. You're standing in it. He didn't smile. Good. 2 days later, Helen brought in an independent surveyor and Dr. Owen Fletcher, a hydrologist with no financial relationship to me, Silver Pines, or the county. Luke watched an excavator crawl toward another trench. They're still building. I can see that. So what stops them? I lifted the laser level from its case. We stop arguing. The survey crew established benchmarks from recorded control points outside the disputed area. Owen compared historical water control documents, topography, drainage features, and the rehabilitation records. Nobody treated Dad's red line as proof. Sentimental evidence is still sentimental evidence until somebody independent verifies it. The first measurement came at Villa 3. The surveyor looked through the instrument. Below, Villa 5. Beep. Below, Villa 9. Beep. Below. By Villa 14, nobody was making conversation. Tripod moved. Rod planted. Reading called. Number recorded. No speeches. No accusations. Just elevation. Rebecca arrived before noon. What is this? Helen answered before I could. Independent documentation. On an active construction site. On property whose title and water status remain disputed. Rebecca pointed toward the empty basin. There is no water. Owen closed his field tablet. I'm documenting hydrology and elevation, ma'am. Water being absent today doesn't erase either. By late afternoon, we had preliminary measurements for all 37 structures. 31 foundations sat below the documented normal operating elevation. 6 were higher. For about 10 seconds, Rebecca looked relieved. Then 6 are fine. Owen looked toward the access road. Not necessarily. The road serving those 6 dropped through the basin. So did portions of the utilities and drainage network. A house could be above water and still become useless if the only road to it wasn't. Marcus arrived while the survey crew was checking a drainage crossing. He studied the numbers for a long time. Then he walked over to me. I never saw this elevation sheet. Helen turned toward him. Was it in your site package? No. Who assembled the package? He hesitated. Silver Pines coordinated the source materials. Across the basin, Rebecca was already on her phone. For the first time since I met her, she wasn't looking at me like I was the problem. She was looking at the villas like they might be evidence. The drainage problem gave the county another reason to slow down. During the survey, Owen had noticed that a temporary construction crossing near the northern inflow sat higher than the historical channel grade. On dry days, it looked harmless. A broad strip of compacted fill carrying trucks across what appeared to be nothing more than a shallow depression. After the rain, it looked different. Water pooled upstream of the crossing, carrying leaves, silt, and pine needles against the fill. On the downstream side, the old channel continued toward the basin. Owen crouched beside the pool and took a series of measurements. Did they submit a drainage detail for this? He asked Marcus. Marcus opened his tablet and searched. There should be one. Should be is not a drawing number. Rebecca arrived while they were still looking. It's temporary access, she said. Owen did not look up. Temporary fill can still change flow. It has been dry for years. Water infrastructure has an unfortunate habit of becoming relevant when water arrives. The county inspector asked for the approved detail. Nobody could produce it on site. That did not mean the crossing was illegal. It meant the county could not verify it was authorized in the configuration they were seeing, so it ordered the area left untouched pending engineering review. Rebecca turned to me. You called them over a puddle? I didn't build the puddle. Luke coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. The inspector looked at Rebecca. Ma'am, Mr. Caldwell did not create the review standard. We're checking whether construction altered a mapped inflow path. Rebecca's expression hardened. The drainage review later confirmed that the crossing needed correction under supervision. It did not cause the lake's drawdown, and it was not the central mistake in the project, but it became important for another reason. It showed how many decisions had been made from the same assumption. Dry men irrelevant. Old channel? Irrelevant. Old marker? Irrelevant. Old ownership record? Irrelevant. Old operating elevation? Irrelevant. Until suddenly none of them were old enough to ignore. 3 days later, the county temporarily suspended construction pending review. That afternoon, the planning director sat across from Rebecca Marcus, 2 attorneys, Helen, Owen, and me. He opened the permit file. Your application describes this site as a permanently dewatered basin. Rebecca nodded. Correct. Helen slid forward a rehabilitation record. This describes a controlled drawdown with continuing water management status and anticipated restoration after specified work. One of Rebecca's attorneys leaned toward the page. That does not establish exactly when water would return. No, Helen said, but it raises a fairly serious question about the word permanently. The room went quiet. Rebecca looked directly at me. Mr. Caldwell has made it clear he intends to bring the water back. I intend to follow the approved operating process. There, she said. That's a threat. No. Her attorney asked. Have you opened any control structure? No. Do you intend to? Not outside whatever procedure is legally authorized after inspection and clearance. Rebecca shook her head. He's threatening 37 homes. Owen finally spoke. The gate is not the only way water enters a lake. Everyone turned toward him. Northern Creek inflow. Direct rainfall. Surface runoff. Groundwater response. Gravity does not require Mr. Caldwell to operate anything. The planning director ordered the controls documented and temporarily sealed while the review continued. Fine with me. I wanted witnesses. That night, rain began tapping against my windows. Nothing dramatic. No flash flood. No thunderstorm worthy of television. Just steady November rain. By midnight, the gutters were humming. At 5:40 the next morning, Luke knocked on my bedroom door. Dad, I was awake before he finished. What? You need to see this. We drove down in darkness. Rain hissed across the windshield. Mud pulled at the truck tires near the basin. Luke turned the headlights toward Villa 3. The lake answered with light. A shallow silver sheet stretched across the lowest clay. Only a few inches in places, but enough to fill the foundation trench and reflect the unfinished framing above it. The gate was still sealed. No pump had started. No pipe had opened. Rain had simply found the lowest ground. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later. He stepped out of his truck, looked at the water, and said nothing. Rebecca came next. Her boots stopped at the edge of the mud. She looked at me. What did you do? I pointed toward the western control structure. The county seal was untouched. Then I pointed north, where runoff was trickling down the old channel. Nothing. This wasn't here yesterday. It rained. You expect me to believe this is normal? I looked at the reflection of Villa 3 trembling in 2 inches of water. You wanted proof this was a lake. A raindrop hit the surface. Then another. It just answered. Rebecca stared at the water as though it had betrayed her. But water doesn't take sides. It doesn't read HOA newsletters or sales schedules. It goes where elevation sends it. And for the first time, Silver Pines wasn't standing on a map labeled dry basin. They were standing beside water that had begun remembering the shape of home. 4 days later, Helen called me into her office. Marcus was already there. He looked exhausted. On the conference table sat a printed email. Helen tapped the date. 8 months before the first foundation. The email came from a consulting engineer retained during early site review. 3 instructions were highlighted. Verify lakebed ownership. Confirm historical operating elevation. Confirm long-term water control status before final site design. Luke, standing behind me, whispered. They were warned. Helen held up a hand. Keep reading. Below the consultant's warning was Rebecca's reply. Additional lake review threatens the sales schedule. Proceed using the current dry basin designation while the remaining issues are handled separately. Nobody spoke. Not for several seconds. The ventilation system hummed overhead. Marcus rubbed both hands over his face. I never got that email. Helen looked at him. What did you get? A site package identifying the basin as available development acreage. No historical operating elevation. No restoration schedule. No unresolved lakebed title issue. Who supplied it? Silver Pines. Helen laid 3 documents side by side. The sales brochure. Lakefront living. The county description. Permanently dewatered basin. The consultant warning. Verify lakebed ownership and water control status. 3 audiences. 3 versions of the same place. That email changed everything. Up to that moment, Silver Pines could argue incompetence, bad mapping, incomplete consulting, or over-reliance on permits. Now there was evidence that the right questions had been asked before construction, and that Rebecca had chosen schedule over answers. Helen submitted the correspondence to the county. Construction remained suspended. The title review produced another problem for Silver Pines. There was no recorded transfer showing that my family had conveyed the Caldwell Lake basin to the HOA or its developer. They owned adjoining parcels. They had certain access rights. They had permits based on submitted plans. But approval to build did not manufacture ownership of land they could not show they owned. That evening, Rebecca called me. "You've made your point. I haven't made anything. The documents did. This project represents years of work. So does a lake." Her voice dropped. "You could help solve this." "How?" "Keep the basin dry." There it was. Not "the lake is gone." Not "you have no rights." Keep the basin dry. I looked through my kitchen window toward the dark ridge. "You were warned before construction. You don't understand the pressure we were under." I almost laughed. Pressure was something I understood. Water pressure, financial pressure, legal pressure. They all exposed weak structures eventually. The next week, Silver Pines sent buyers an email claiming the project faced an intentional flooding threat from the neighboring landowner. Me. Helen told me not to respond publicly. I didn't. The county did. An inspector photographed the sealed control structure. Owen submitted rainfall totals and drainage observations. The county confirmed there was no evidence I had opened a gate, pumped water, or manipulated the system. Meanwhile, rainwater continued collecting in the lowest areas. A prospective buyer approached me near the temporary fence one Saturday. "My wife and I put a deposit on Villa 18, he said. "The HOA says you're flooding the project." "I'm not." "Then where is the water coming from?" I pointed toward the North Channel. "Rain. Runoff. Gravity." His wife opened the glossy brochure she was carrying. On the cover, a finished villa stood beside a blue lake. She looked from the brochure to the actual water covering part of the access road. "Lakefront," she whispered. I didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to add. A week later, the county hearing room was full. Silver Pines attorneys, engineers, board members, Marcus, Rebecca, Helen, Owen, surveyors, planning staff. The commissioner began with the simplest question. Which recorded instrument transferred the Caldwell Lake basin to Silver Pines Estates or its developer? One of their attorneys answered carefully. "Our title position involves mapping, approvals, reliance, and issues that may require separate adjudication." "That wasn't my question," the commissioner said. For the first time all morning, I almost smiled. The attorney paused. "No instrument transferring the entire basin has been produced." Then came the survey. 31 foundations below the normal operating elevation. 6 higher, but dependent on roads or infrastructure descending into the basin. Then the rehabilitation file. Controlled drawdown. Inspection. Repair. Eventual staged restoration. Then the consultant email. Verify lakebed ownership. Confirm historical operating elevation. Confirm long-term water control status. Then Rebecca's reply about the sales schedule. Nobody needed to call her reckless. The email did that work on its own. The hearing also revealed something Rebecca had not expected. The board itself was beginning to fracture. 2 Silver Pines board members sat behind her rather than beside her attorneys. During a break, one of them, a retired accountant named Thomas Bell, asked Helen whether he could submit a copy of a board packet he had received before the Phase 2 vote. Helen told him to provide it through the proper channel. When the hearing resumed, the packet was added to the record. Most of it was ordinary: budgets, architectural renderings, financing assumptions, sales projections. But buried in an appendix was a one-line risk note from the consultant team. Reservoir status and underlying basin title require final confirmation before irreversible vertical construction. Thomas testified that he remembered asking about it. "What were you told?" the commissioner asked. "That staff and council were handling it." "Did the board receive a written confirmation before foundations began?" "Not that I can locate." Rebecca's attorney objected to characterizing the note as a stop work instruction. The commissioner agreed that it was not one. Then he asked the question that mattered. Was final confirmation produced? No one on the Silver Pines side answered immediately. Marcus finally said, "Not in the package I received." That silence did more damage than an accusation could have. The second board member, a woman named Denise Harper, testified that she had believed the lakefront marketing referred to a future amenity Silver Pines controlled, not a restored family reservoir with a separate ownership history. Rebecca turned in her chair. "We discussed the basin repeatedly." Denise shook her head. "We discussed views. We discussed branding. We discussed whether buyers liked the word lakefront. I do not remember the board being told 31 foundations would sit below a documented operating elevation. The room changed after that. Until then, Rebecca had been trying to frame the problem as me versus Silver Pines. Now Silver Pines was asking questions of itself. Rebecca's attorney tried one more angle. Mr. Caldwell benefits from the water returning. Helen answered, benefit is not causation. Owen followed, and water management is not a private revenge mechanism. Restoration, if authorized, follows engineering procedure, safety conditions, and watershed behavior. The commissioner maintained the stop work restrictions and directed the parties into the appropriate title, permitting, remediation, and financial responsibility processes. Nobody handed me 37 villas. Nobody ordered bulldozers to arrive by sunrise. Nobody was arrested. Real disputes involving developers, buyers, insurers, engineers, contractors, and partially completed structures do not end with one theatrical sentence. But the most important thing was settled for the moment. Silver Pines could not use a development permit as proof that it owned the lakebed, and it could not blame me for water I had not released. Outside the hearing room, Rebecca caught up with me. Do you understand what this is going to cost? I looked at her. I understand what 37 villas cost. We relied on professionals. Then sort out responsibility with the professionals. You're enjoying this. No. And I meant it. Buyers had deposits tied up. Contractors had performed work from plans somebody else approved. Engineers and insurers were about to spend months arguing over responsibility. Justice becomes messy when one bad decision travels through enough signatures. I wanted you to stop before this became expensive, I said. You wanted the questions to wait until after the sales schedule. She had no answer for that. Over the next several months, engineers, attorneys, insurers, county officials, and the affected parties worked through the mess. The final resolution did not happen overnight. Affected buyers were released from contracts or handled through negotiated arrangements. Engineers evaluated the structures. Materials that could be salvaged were removed. Foundations within the restored reservoir footprint were demolished under approved plans. Utility trenches were cleared. Temporary roads disappeared. 37 roofs came down one by one. Silver Pines Phase 2 did not vanish entirely. Revised plans moved future construction to higher ground outside the recorded basin. That never bothered me. They had every right to build where they actually had the right to build. Rebecca's name disappeared from Silver Pines correspondence before the last removal crew left. The association's independent review concluded that the project had been advanced despite unresolved ownership, elevation, and water status questions. At a special board meeting, residents demanded to know why the warning had been treated as a scheduling problem instead of a stop sign. By the end of that meeting, Rebecca Sterling was no longer HOA president. I didn't attend the vote. I didn't need to watch her lose something to know I had protected what mattered. Residents asked for dates. When did the board first learn the basin had a separate recorded ownership history? When did anyone confirm the operating elevation? Who approved marketing that promised lakefront living while regulatory paperwork described permanent dewatering? Why did the HOA ask me to keep the basin dry only after the dispute surfaced? Why were buyers told I posed an intentional flooding threat when the county had documented sealed controls and natural runoff? Rebecca answered some questions by pointing to consultants, others by pointing to council, others by saying the project had relied on county approvals. But every answer pushed responsibility outward while the documents kept pulling it back toward one decision. Continue before the unanswered questions were resolved. Aaron and Dana Mills attended that meeting. They eventually received their deposit back through the negotiated process and bought a house in another part of the county. Months later, Dana sent Helen a photograph of their daughter standing beside a moving truck. On the back, she had written one sentence: "Glad we found out before closing." Helen handed the photo to me and said, "That is probably the best outcome anyone was going to get from this mess." She was right. 8 months after the morning I counted 37 roofs, Luke and I stood beside the western structure while technicians completed the final restoration inspection. Everything was documented. Everything had signatures. Everything had witnesses. Exactly how I wanted it. The northern creek moved steadily into the basin. Rain and seasonal inflow had already begun reclaiming the lowest ground. After the required safety checks, The reservoir was allowed to return incrementally toward its authorized operating range. No dramatic wall of water. No revenge switch. No moment where I stood over a gate, smiling, while houses disappeared. Just engineering. Gravity. Time. The level climbed over the following weeks. First across old construction scars. Then over the former access road. Then past the places where Villa 3 and Villa 18 had stood. Each morning, I photographed the same reference points. Luke eventually stopped asking how much farther the water had to go. He knew my answer. We measure. By early June, only the top of an old steel survey marker remained visible. 3 days later, it slipped beneath the surface. Luke watched it disappear. Think Grandpa would have enjoyed this? He would have complained we were standing around instead of fixing fence. Luke laughed. Then came the morning I had been waiting for. Sunrise burned orange across Caldwell Lake. The surface was almost perfectly still. I walked to the western control structure and placed my hand against the concrete. The faded red line sat inches above the water. I opened Dad's blue notebook. Near the back, beneath decades-old elevation figures, he had written a sentence I had forgotten was there. Water remembers the shape of home. I waited. Not because those final inches mattered legally. The documents had already settled what mattered. They mattered to me. By afternoon, a light wind moved across the lake. One small wave touched the red paint. Then another. Luke was already walking toward the maintenance barn. Come on. We pulled Dad's old aluminum fishing boat into the daylight. Same scratched hull. Same dent near the bow. Same boat that had collected dust while 37 luxury villas stood where water belonged. We dragged it down the restored shoreline. Metal scraped clay. Scrape. Scrape. Then the sound stopped. The boat floated. Luke looked at me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Months earlier, Rebecca had stood in that basin and told me empty ground could not be a lake. She had confused dry with abandoned, permits with ownership, confidence with evidence, and delay with disappearance. She had been warned before the first foundation was poured. She chose the sales schedule anyway. In the end, I never flooded her development. I never opened a gate to make a point. I never blocked a road, touched a foundation, or turned water into a weapon. I measured. I documented. I waited for the records, the engineers, the county, and the truth to catch up with the concrete. 37 villas had been built on the assumption that Caldwell Lake would never come home. They were gone now. The lake wasn't. Dad had been right all along. Water can leave without giving up its address. And if you were in my place, standing on your own property while an HOA president told you 37 luxury homes mattered more than your deed, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories where arrogance runs headfirst into evidence, subscribe. Around here, the paperwork usually gets the last word.